and welcome to Cleaning Up the Mess. This is CNC3. I'm Ira Mathur. We're very pleased to welcome back on part 2 of this show on agriculture and the environment. Today, Vasant Bharat, the Minister of Food Production, Land and Marine Affairs. Last week, we touched on the toxins in our food, meats and water. This week, we talk of our agricultural land, our cocoa and coffee industry, and the invasion of the Nariva swamp by farmers, as well as forest fires, some of it which does not come under his remit, but I'm going to ask him those questions anyway. So I am pleased to welcome back on the show the Minister of Agriculture. Mr. Bharat, welcome back.
Thank you for having me again.
Thank you so much. Let's go straight into it. What proportion of Caroni lands, or I should say the ex-Caroni lands, is still being used for sugar production, and what proportion of those lands are being used for other types of food production?
Well, none of it is now being used for sugar at all. As you know, in 2003, the then government closed down the sugar industry and effectively was supposed to have given to the Caroni workers 2-acre parcels of lands as well as residential plots. That particular exercise has been stuck in court, subject to a court. We're waiting a court judgment at this point in time to try to allocate those lands to the Caroni farmers. So currently most of the lands that fell under Caroni 1975 Limited is out of productive use, unless there are those who are, unless there are people who are squatting on those lands, and there are some. So Caroni had effectively about 80,000 acres of land under sugarcane cultivation. We've taken over some of those lands and we've distributed, I think, about lands to about 1,500 farmers. So there are about 6,000 farmers still to get their lands. What we're hoping to do, what has happened in the meantime is a number of these farmers have grown old. Some of them, unfortunately, have passed away. Their children are no longer interested in getting involved in farming. So what we're attempting to do is to pool those lands, those 2-acre plots, for 2 reasons. One, because, as I said, some people are not interested in going into farming. But secondly, to be in a position to mechanize the farms, because you require larger plots to be able to mechanize. And then we're going to start developing cooperatives to grow crops on a much larger basis. So the short answer to your question is that very little of the Caroni lands, the actual Caroni lands, are being used productively at this point in time. The other issue was that the previous regime had embarked on a process of putting houses down on fertile arable lands through the EMBD, the Estate Management Development Business Corporation. Since that organization has fallen under my ministry, which is only in the last month and a half, I've stopped all of those projects. Unfortunately, we have a situation where in a number of areas they had already put infrastructure into the ground. And as a direct result, those lands can no longer be brought into productive use in terms of for farming purposes. What is worse is that it has contributed in no small measure to the issues of flooding that we've experienced in the last 2 or 3 years. Areas that have never flooded before, like areas in Couva and Felicity and so on, are now subject to massive flooding, because where previously the sugarcane lands were able to absorb the rainfall, now the rainfall just runs off because of the concrete. And it has led to significant displacement of people and significant hardship. So we're addressing those problems now, but as I say, more importantly, we've now stopped all projects of building on agricultural land.
But as a result, some of the most fertile lands in our country, and the idea was, presumably when you wanted to distribute these lands to farmers, was that more food would be grown locally and then food prices would come down. So that dream is destroyed for now?
I wouldn't say for now. In fact, that dream of using those particular lands would have been destroyed forever. Because unless we go into those lands and start to prize out the concrete that's in the ground, the infrastructure with regard to water, electricity, all of those sewage, that's all in the ground already. And that would be a very, very expensive proposition. So those lands are lost to agriculture really forever. Unless we now involve ourselves in putting things in like overground ponds to grow, to get involved in aquaculture, those are the only possible agricultural type uses we can use the lands for.
So what are you going to do with it?
We're now developing other areas of the country where there is fertile land. And as I said, we've stopped that practice of putting housing down on agricultural lands. We are where we are. We've inherited, unfortunately, a situation that we have no control over with regard to the housing areas where houses have been put down. But we've ensured that we've stopped that practice, and we are now ensuring that fertile, agricultural, good soil and good lands are being used for agriculture only.
What an end to Caroni. But anyway, let's talk about the previous government. They had pushed large-scale, capital-intensive farming, for example, in Chaguaramas. Are you going to continue with that, or are you going to throw it out?
Well, the first order of day was to call in all of the licensees, and there are 11 of them, who had planned and who had made proposals to get involved in large-scale farming. And I called them all in, spoke to all of them with a view to understanding where in the process they are, because the previous government had spent $100 million on putting in infrastructure for those lands. Infrastructure that, if the truth be told, is probably not worth more than $10 or $12 million, but they spent $100 million putting that into place. And the results have been very discouraging so far. So I called all of the licensees in and I said, look, what stage are you at? What's the status of your project? I'm going to give you X number of months to get this up and running. If you can't, then you'll have to move on and somebody else will have to take your place. The one at Chaguaramas, unfortunately, does not fall under the control of the Ministry of Food Production, Land and Marine Affairs. It was initially under the control of the Planning Ministry, and now falls under the control and purview of the Ministry of Housing and the Environment, simply because it is part of the CDA, the Chaguaramas Development Authority, which falls under that ministry.
The bureaucracy is going to kill us, Mr.
Well,
Bharat.
I have since spoken to both Dr. Monilal and the Prime Minister with regard to excising that farm out of that ministry and placing it under the Ministry of Food Production, because I think it was this very station, Roshan Sukram, one of the other reporters, who did a report last week on the Chaguaramas development on the Chaguaramas farm, and reported that it was now overgrown with weeds. There was very little being grown on the farms. The greenhouses were almost abandoned. And that is after the previous regime spent $19 million on that farm. And in fact, the chief executive officer and the chairman of that particular farm this year requested from government a further $35 million to continue. So that is on hold at this point in time until that farm is transferred across and we can make productive use of it and we can control what the outputs are.
Well, I'm glad you're not throwing the baby out with the bath water, so to speak. We'll take a short break. As you watch, I want to remind you to send in your comments and suggestions to cleaningupthemess@guardian.co.tt. This is an environmental special on CNC3. We'll be right back.